Well, thank you, John, very much. This is 2020 9.0. I've had the honor to work with John on many of these. I've always appreciated them because it really brings together a lot of the usual postal suspects like me, but also a broader array of folks in the logistics industry, the package parcel business, even folks who are not part of the general postal ecosystem, shall we say, both domestic and international. And it's an opportunity to see where we're at, where we're going, because as we all know, this is a very dynamic marketplace with immense challenges, particularly immense challenges for our national postal operators and the United States Postal Service in particular. So I want to say thank you to John for 9.0, nine consecutive times putting this together. I was thinking, it'd be interesting to go back to the first one in 2010, and that was before I got on the commission, to look at what people were thinking about in a decade is going to happen in 2020, and maybe pull out some of those tapes and see where we were right and where we might be wrong. I know at one of these panel discussions I had the honor of participating on several years ago, I had suggested maybe it was time to rethink being part of the UPU, and I think people thought that would never happen. So who knows? And the last panel did a great job outlining the challenges and opportunities as we look to that. But again, thank you to John. I would be remiss as well if I didn't at least point out there's one person from the Postal Regulatory Commission with me today. She's our most senior executive at the Commission. Ann Fisher is the head of our Public Affairs and Government Relations Office. She's over in the corner. And I want to particularly point her out, in addition to being the other PRC person here, the president and his team rightfully and wisely nominated her to be a commissioner of the Postal Regulatory Commission. And so I'm hopeful for they always say in the Senate confirmation process, there's no presumption of confirmation. So having said there's no presumption of confirmation, I'm hopeful that there will be a speedy confirmation soon, and she'll bring a great perspective to being a colleague as a commissioner on the panel. But why don't we jump into it today? As the regulator of our nation's postal administration, I want to focus on the challenges facing the U.S. Postal Service. Now, in the U.S., it's important to keep in mind that the Postal Service is 100% part of the federal government. Today, the Postal Service is a $70 billion operation with more than 600,000 employees. It is not quasi-government, quasi-private, or quasi-anything. It is 100% part of the federal government, operating as an independent establishment in the executive branch. Yet the Postal Service receives no tax dollars for operating expenses and relies completely on the sale of postage, products, and services to fund its operations. As a separate and independent federal regulatory agency, the Postal Regulatory Commission determines the legality of the Postal Service's prices and products, adjudicates complaints and fair competition issues, and oversees the Postal Service's delivery performance consistent with statutory requirements. The Commission is the regulator, not the operator, of our nation's Postal Service. It is composed of 5 commissioners, each appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. The Commission receives an annual appropriation from the Congress out of the Postal Service Fund. Now, why a regulator for another government agency? Unlike almost any other federal agency, the Postal Service operates in a commercial marketplace while also having a large contingent of captive customers, given the Postal Service's market dominance over certain products and services. The law provides the Postal Service a statutory monopoly over mailboxes and the delivery of letters. The public interest role of a regulator in this case is clear: a need to protect the captive customers and ensure fair competition. The fundamental problem today is that the Postal Service cannot currently generate sufficient funds to cover its mandated expenses and also invest in critically deferred capital needs, such as new delivery vehicles and package sorting equipment. So my plea is that policymakers and we as a nation address a single basic consideration. What are the specific universal service obligations of the Postal Service? In other words, what do each of us as American citizens need from the Postal Service as a government service, and what is the cost? Without greater mission clarity, our Postal Service will be set up for frustration and even risk of failure. The Postal Service is trying to move forward against strong headwinds. The financials of the U.S. Postal Service are a mess. In 2018, the Postal Service had a total net loss of $3.9 billion, which is a $1.2 billion deterioration from 2017. This is the 12th consecutive net loss since 2007 and has increased the cumulative net deficit since then to $62.6 billion. These continuing losses have negatively affected liquidity, requiring the Postal Service to use nearly all of its $15 billion statutory borrowing capacity and causing total liabilities to far exceed total assets by almost $63 billion. Low liquidity levels in recent years have impeded the Postal Service's ability to make capital investments in infrastructure and hindered the growth and productivity enhancements in key assets required for primary postal operations. It now operates an aging vehicle fleet, increasing the need and consequently the cost for maintenance and repair. Also unmet is the need to invest in sorting and handling equipment to fully capitalize on business opportunities in the growing package delivery markets. Since 2007, the volume of market-dominant mail has annually decreased, declining from 211 billion pieces to 141 billion pieces, a 33% drop. Total mail volume in 2018 dropped to levels not seen in more than 32 years. And the Postal Service anticipates further declines and reductions in total volumes in 2019. The aggregate decline in mail volume is the result of the economic recession of 2007, along with the acceleration of a long-term trend of mail migrating to electronic media. According to the Postal Service, the volume lost to electronic alternatives will not return because the movement constitutes a fundamental and permanent change in mail use by households and businesses. The decline in first-class mail is the most troubling, as first-class mail contributes the most to the overhead costs of the Postal Service. Volumes and revenues for competitive products, which are mainly parcels, increased 11% and 11.5% respectively in 2018. Now, while competitive products volume and revenue have grown consistently in recent years, its volume only makes up 3.9% of the total mail volume of the Postal Service. In addition, the margin, that's the overall cost coverage on competitive products, is lower than the margin for first-class mail. In other words, the Postal Service earns more money from first-class mail than it does from marketing mail or competitive product parcels. In summary, the Postal Service faces significant financial obstacles for the future. With the growing liability of unfunded retirement-related obligations, the inability to finance needed capital investments, and the continued loss of high-revenue first-class mail volume, the important task of improving the financial condition of the Postal Service is daunting. The pressing question, therefore, is, what needs to be done to improve the financial condition of the Postal Service? I would argue the starting point is to look at ourselves. What do we as a nation need from a postal and delivery system, and what is its cost? What exactly is universal mail service in the United States? This is the exact same question confronted by last year's presidential task force. In 2018, President Trump issued an executive order establishing the Task Force on the United States Postal System. To quote from the president's order, the USPS is on an unsustainable financial path and must be restructured to prevent a taxpayer-funded bailout. The order goes on to list a series of facts that support that claim and concludes that, quote, "It shall be the policy of the administration that the United States postal system operate under a sustainable business model to provide necessary mail services to citizens and businesses and to compete fairly in commercial markets," end quote. The President's task force brought together agency heads from the Department of Treasury, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Office of Personnel Management. The executive order directed the task force to consult with me as chairman of the commission, but I was not a task force member. Many of the task force report recommendations pertain directly to the work of the commission, including a recommendation to strengthen the commission's role as a regulator. Now, with respect to the task force recommendations, there are many legitimate suggestions provided in the task force report. And working with the Treasury Department and the Postal Service, we at the Commission intend to explore them where administratively possible. However, one of them in particular stands out to me and is consistent with the Commission's recommendations made to Congress in the past. I believe that the single most important thing we can do for the Postal Service and the United States is to clearly define the Postal Service's Universal Service Obligation, or USO. Only by defining the USO clearly can we begin to design a system that will fund the services required. It is our nation's mission statement for the Postal Service. Clarity of mission should be job one. Indeed, defining the USO was the central recommendation of the task force report, comprising its own chapter and making up nearly half of the recommendations. To understand what changes may be necessary to the USO to pursue the policies expressed by this administration and the task force recommendations, it's important to first understand how the USO is currently defined. The Commission has significant experience exploring the question of the USO. The 2006 law directed the Commission to annually estimate the costs of universal service and to submit to the President and Congress a comprehensive report on universal postal service and the postal monopoly in the United States. In that resulting 2008 USO report, the Commission determined that, unlike other countries, the USO in the United States is largely undefined and instead is comprised of a broad set of policy statements with only a few legislative prescriptions. The Commission estimates that the cost of providing universal service to be more than $4.5 billion annually. The Commission has defined the universal service obligation as having 7 attributes: geographic, range of products, access to facilities, delivery frequency, prices, affordability, quality of service, and users' rights or enforcement. Now, other nations have imposed universal service requirements directly on its postal operator by statute, regulation, licensing, or contract. Countries like Australia, Canada, and Germany, just to name a few, have detailed definitions of universal postal service with specific standards for delivery and retail access. Now, aside from the mandate since 1982 to provide 6 days of delivery, Congress has rarely established rigid numerical standards of minimally acceptable service for each of these features. Rather, through its history, the Postal Service has been expected to use its flexibility to meet the needs and expectations of the nation while balancing the delivery of service against budgetary constraints. When assessing the current state of the Postal Service, policymakers should look at this fundamental issue and decide exactly what we as a nation need from the Postal Service, and most importantly, how those expectations are to be funded. In the absence of a clear definition of its governmental mission of universal services, particularly given the Postal Service's current financial challenges, each of us may have a differing view of what the Postal Service must provide in its services and operations to fulfill the USO. And since there is no specific agreed-upon definition, all of our views will have different price tags. Indeed, the fresh look taken by the President's task force last year reached a similar conclusion. Let's look at the task force recommendations on this issue. The task force made 6 administrative and 1 legislative recommendation related to the USO, with an overarching one that the USO be clearly defined. Quote, In the U.S., the USO is not clearly defined. For the Postal Service's business model to achieve sustainability, the USO must be defined with greater specificity. The task force noted that this would help the Postal Service sustainably manage pricing, cost, and products. Let's look at one of the recommendations to explore how these might work. One of the recommendations was that the USO be clearly defined. As part of the recommendation to clearly define the USO, the task force stated, provide a targeted definition of minimum essential postal services that, due to specific social and economic needs, have a basis for government protection. The Commission has the existing administrative authority to review and approve specific product eliminations, transfers, and introductions requested by the Postal Service within the context of the USO. In considering such requests, the Commission would give due regard to a variety of statutory factors in its determination: the availability and nature of private sector enterprises engaged in delivery of the product involved, the views of those who use the product on the appropriateness of the proposed action, and the likely impact of the proposed action on small business concerns. Additionally, the Commission would evaluate any proposed changes to postal product offerings for consistency with the other overarching policies of the law. It's important to note that the Postal Service, any users of the mails, or the Commission on its own initiative may request, or in the Commission's case, begin such a proceeding to modify the product lists. Now, this is just one example, but the bottom line for all of these is that the final decision taken by the Commission in furtherance of the task force recommendations would require a majority vote of the commissioners in office, as is the case with all Commission decisions. Therefore, I can't say for certain what the Commission's outcome would be on any of the task force recommendations, yet regardless of whether the Postal Service or the Commission initiate any of the recommended administrative actions, nearly all of them would require open and transparent proceedings before the Commission. That means public notice and comment proceedings in the light of day, in compliance with the Administrative Procedures Act, before any of the ideas could be finalized. Now, in the same way that Congress created a regulator in 1970 and got out of the business of setting rates, and then expanded the Commission's authority and powers in 2006 to also oversee service and competition, Congress created a board of directors in 1970, a board of governors, to direct the, quote, exercise of the power of the Postal Service and to, quote, represent the public interest generally. Despite the existence of this 11-person board, or lack thereof, in fact, there are only 2 governors remaining on the board when there are supposed to be 9, and we're honored to be joined by one of them today, Governor Williams. The other members of the board, being the Postmaster General or Deputy, as this governing board tries to navigate these rapidly changing waters, they can't lose sight of the USO. But what is it? The problem is that the Postal Service cannot be sure. However, today in 2019, as I outlined, the Postal Service financials are a mess. In that environment, aside from the financial pressure of generating sufficient funds to remain solvent, a key worry is somehow funding the $4.5 billion universal service obligations, let alone monies to undertake capital investments and pay other multi-billion-dollar obligations such as retiree costs. The task force itself recommended a variety of changes to the Postal Service's operating model, as well as its role in mail and package markets. Others have called for the Postal Service to enter the world of banking. Some have decried their closing or consolidation of facilities. Past proposals in Congress would direct them to offer certain services, such as sensors, tell them what vehicles to procure and how to do it, institute bans on closing any post offices or facilities from anywhere from 2 to 5 years, mandate specific service standards. The list goes on and on. Now, let me be clear. I am agnostic on what Congress mandates. If 218 House members and 51 senators manage to agree and the President signs their legislation, then that, under the Constitution, is the prerogative and authority of the Congress. What I am deeply concerned by, however, is that there's absolutely no cost-benefit analysis that goes on when folks want to step back into the role of the board of directors, despite having created one in 1970, and expand the Postal Service's work, or conversely, put limits and restrictions and mandates on their operations. Surely, there is a limit to what the Postal Service can afford and remain self-sustaining. If instead, like other nations, we have a thoughtful back to basics, what do we require the Postal Service to do as a government entity to serve this nation? That is, what is the USO and what is the cost? We can better ensure that it can remain self-financing. We can also better analyze when policymakers think about breaking open that definition and adding or subtracting requirements, that a thoughtful analysis is undertaken as to the effect on its bottom line and ability to remain self-sustaining. Thus, it seems that policymakers really need to start at the beginning and decide what exactly we as a nation need and how it can be funded. The Postal Service, with its balance sheet and future projections, needs clarity and certainty. I would suggest it is time. In fact, it is overdue. Now, is it pie in the sky to think that this back to basics can occur? No, not any more than fixes that have yet to see enactment, let alone Senate or House floor action, despite yeoman's efforts in congressional committees for the past decade. Maybe a focus on the fundamentals would be more fruitful. Congress would not have to start at scratch. The Postal Regulatory Commission laid the foundation in the comprehensive report on the USO. Congress can pick it up and hit the ground running on better defining the USO. One approach Congress may consider is the 1996 Telecommunications Act, where the Federal Communications Commission has proven successful in defining universal service in the telecommunications space under congressional criteria. Given the PRC's substantial work on the USO, a similar approach may be helpful here. While fixing the balance sheet is critical, my call today is to not ignore the fundamentals. The Postal Service can only weather the vast challenges and changes if they have clarity of mission. The task force report, the Commission's work in this area, and other objective parties such as the Government Accountability Office have all highlighted this urgent need to provide a clear mission statement for our national treasure, nearly 244 years old and rooted in the Constitution. Despite challenges to doing so, I do remain hopeful that our leaders will, at the end of the day, have the foresight and willingness to make tough decisions, the wisdom to see the world as it is rather than as we would like it to be, and the courage to compromise on behalf of the greater good. Our nation's postal system, its 634,000 employees, and the more than 328 million Americans who depend on it expect no less. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
I have this one. Thank you, Robert. Or I should say, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Do you want to sit and take a couple questions, or from here, or
Whatever's easier. I'll
yeah,
take.
Okay.
I'll sit with you.
Take a sip of water. You can. All right. We have one other mic here, please. So let's we have this incredible opportunity to ask Robert some questions, and I'm going to ask the first one, and that is because I know you were involved as an architect of sorts of PAEA. And I'm sure in 2006 or 5, whenever you were working on that and it got approved, you didn't think it would still be in place in 2000, what are we, 19? And I'm just curious, and of course after 2006, at that time, there was beginning to be a decline in first-class mail, but then the recession hit, and marketing mail went off a cliff. And then all of a sudden, it looked like the bottom was falling out. And it's been falling out, at least dribbling out since then. I'm just curious, from the, did you take into consideration the USO back then? And did it seem to be that critical? And I'm just wondering what you've observed over these, 13 years or something, that what went wrong? And the bigger question here is, I can understand fundamentals. It's all about the USO, that's mission. So we got to work on that. But you have any other comments about greater reform that is really going to get at the losses you're talking about?
Sure. Yeah. Looking back, first it took us 12 years from the time we started working on that 2006 bill. We had actually first introduced it in June of 1996. And I remember going to panels on, the Postal Service was 25 years old in 1995, and where have they been and where they're going. And, we're getting to the point now where in another decade I'll be able to go to the panels on the 25 years of the 2006 law, and hopefully we'll have a new law by then. But the reason I point out the time it took, by the time the law got enacted in 2006, and it's the nature of legislation and compromise, I think it was a perfectly well-designed piece of legislation for the Postal Service of 1999. And by the time it got enacted, 80% of it was what we had introduced in 1996, but it took that time to get the attention and focus. And none of us foresaw that literally the ink was dry on President Bush's signature on that legislation in December of 2006, and the economy went right off the cliff into one of the worst recessions we've ever seen since the Great Depression. And that was a recipe for insolvency. And so that was the big accelerator. I think largely the law as structured was very good and is very good. There was what can be charitably characterized as an overly ambitious requirement to pre-fund future retiree health benefits. And with the Great Recession happening, that just turned it into a greater mess. So I think it was a well-crafted law and for the times, but none of us saw the recession hit. But that being said, knowing that it was not the be-all and end-all, we did include in the legislation recognizing, as you said, John, that we're going to have to revisit this again and get at some of the fundamentals. So, for example, that's why the law mandated that the newly empowered Postal Regulatory Commission conduct a study on the universal service obligation. What is it? How might it be defined? And also the monopoly. Because we recognized we've got to start laying a groundwork to start looking at the fundamentals. I don't think anyone expected that we'd have to worry about them so soon. But there was a recognition that the world is changing. And to your last question, I really do think it's difficult to, there's a fire going on at the Postal Service, and the financial relief is only going to come from an act of Congress and President signing that bill. And for 10 years now, there has been yeoman efforts to try to pass legislation. And every year it's like Charlie Brown and Lucy with the football. We're going to get it this year. And guess what? It hasn't happened. And I would love to see that happen. I'm an advocate for that when I talk to folks on the Hill. But the reality is there, at some point you got to count votes, and you got to count the reality, and we could get into the reasons why that hasn't passed. And so we've really, to me, let's spend the time focusing on defining what this is, and then you can better grapple with how it is that we can sustain it. Because otherwise you might be making decisions on a size and scope that is too small or too big.
Right. That sounds practical to me. Thank you. That was a great answer. Clearly, are there other questions for Chairman? Ramesh, please.
Thank you, Robert. I have a question regarding, you mentioned the 1996 Telecom Act established universal service obligations from a telecommunications point of view. As you and I know, that's evolved since then through broadband definitions from, I think it was 200 kilobits to now I think you can actually draw from the Universal Service Fund for wireless access. So they're kind of, and I think a chunk of that evolution of the definition of USO in telecommunications was driven by the FCC as opposed to Congress. So my question is, can the PRC unilaterally start with whatever definition there is and evolve it without an act of Congress in the postal case?
Yes and no.
Sounds like Washington.
Yeah. I mentioned the President's Task Force. Their report had a variety of recommendations to, in essence, asked that those 7 features of universal service be defined by the Postal Service through the administrative process. And I do believe legally they are right. The Postal Service largely could do that. On many of those features, it's one of the last anachronistic holdovers from when we were the Postal Rate Commission. We do not have final authority. We would only have advisory opinion authority. So it would land to whatever the Postal Service would want to do. The only feature in which they need legislative relief is for Congress to stop adding to every annual appropriation bill this mandate since they've been doing since 1982 to say 6 days of delivery. So that's the yes on how we could try to do it ourselves. My concern with that process is, A, I'm not sure the Postal Service fully embraces the task force view of their authority to do it. And even if they did, I'm concerned that it's a unilateral definition by the interested party, the Postal Service. And I think the world of the governors and Dave, but it's just a nature of the beast. I do think when you go through a regulatory process, as what we do at the Commission, it's in the open light of day. We hear from all parties and we weigh all that and we call it as we see it. And if folks don't like that, they could take it to court. So my peeling a page out of the FCC did not have that authority until the Telecom Act of 1996. And one can debate, how it's funded and the fund and all the and they were dealing with private sector providers. The example that I draw from that is rather than waiting around for Congress to come together on 218 votes and define all those criteria, which will be like waiting for Godot. I mean, they can't even pass the financial relief, let alone all the competing interests. Do what they did in the telecom space, which was say, here's the criteria. We want to be concerned about the special needs of Alaska. And FCC, you now define it in the open light of day. And so until we get that authority, we could either do this administrative process, which wouldn't be wouldn't get to it all because some of it we don't have authority over, the Postal Service does. And the last thing I'd say, the beauty, I believe, of that process is, as you mentioned with the FCC, as the marketplace changes, you can, by regulation, then change to adapt it. You don't have to wait for 218 votes in the House and 51 in the Senate to change that definition. The regulator can be relatively more nimble.
Well, go ahead, and let me ask one question quickly in a minute, just a point of information, because I don't think we're going to be able to get this otherwise. A lot of people are astounded that well, at least we have 2 governors now, outside governors. Where's David? Thanks to Dave being there. And yet we don't have a proper quorum, and there's a couple nominees, and now Ann is nominated for the PRC. What takes so long in the Senate to approve these people who've been nominated by the president and who are obviously very well qualified? And are we getting closer to getting any more governors approved?
Yeah, we are getting closer. There's 2 additional nominees who are pending on the Senate calendar right now. There's an additional 3rd nominee whose hearing is later this month. On the one hand, it's not unique to the Postal Service or the Postal Regulatory Commission. It's just the nature of the beast of the process of nominating and confirming appointees to the executive branch. It's a process that takes too long. The Senate has tried to, in previous years, deal with it, but that's a larger issue than just the Postal Service or PRC. However, in the Postal Service's case, the previous administration, President Obama, had, starting around 2012, kept nominating a full slate of nominees. And like the Postal Regulatory Commission, the board is in the same way. No more than, in 9 in the case of the governors, no more, they have 9, so no more than 5, no more than 3 of the 5 can be of the same political party. So usually what happens is you have a slate of Democrats and Republicans being nominated. There were concerns by a senator or 2 over President Obama's Republican nominees. And so, given the Senate procedures that were in place at the time, they never got a vote, and that's why we ended up to a place where there ended up being no governors or directors of the Postal Service, which really is disconcerting and get into a whole other thing. But that's the somewhat shorter answer to a long question.
Not sure I clearly understand it, but
Politics.
Dave, you need some company. So, I'm sorry, there was a question here from eBay? Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Ashley Schillingsburg with
Ashley.
eBay. Thank you so much for coming today, Mr. Chairman. As you, I'm sure, know, eBay has long been a partner with the U.S. Postal Service, where we've always been committed to their viability and their success. 75% of the transactions in our platform go through the USPS, and that's much higher if you're looking just at SMEs. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you're thinking about impact on SMEs as you're looking at various proposals to redefine the USO, especially around this concept of essential services and consequently non-essential services. And would love to hear how impact on SMEs participation in e-commerce in general is part of those conversations. Thank you.
Sure. No, thank you. Any opportunity or movement to define the USO under the current law would have to go through a regulatory process before us in which all parties have the opportunity to comment. The example I gave of the President's task force recommendation as an example, if we were to move forward, one of the statutory criteria, in fact, for us to consider is the impact on small business users and concerns. And so as a regulatory agency, we welcome and thrive on comments from all parties, and that factors into our decision making. So nothing would ever be final without that. And the suggestion I was outlining of one approach if Congress were to mandate, like the FCC, for us to define the process, again, a regulatory process in the light of day, opportunity for us to hear. So nothing would be by fiat, unilateral, and if parties are affected. But no, you're right. The Postal Service, with all their financial challenges, need that strong foundation that does exist today in its customer base. And I can say both myself personally and all my colleagues on the Commission are very sensitive to that. And so we certainly don't want to create unintended consequences that make the matters worse than they already are.
Thank you. I think we're at time, and I appreciate, was there another one quick question? Okay, so Mr. Chairman, thank you once again. And I hope you'll come next year, too.